And so right now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, who is George Davis. He is Regents Professor and Provost Emeritus at the University of Arizona. He is a field-oriented structural geologist whose main focus has been on the tectonics of the Colorado Plateau and the Basin Range provinces. And he's also done some research on the geoarchaeology in the country of Greece. George joined the faculty of the Department of Geosciences at the University of Arizona in 1970, and over the years has held a number of academic leadership positions, including Department Head of Geosciences and Executive Vice President and Provost. He received his BA from the College of Wooster, Ohio, his master's degree from the University of Texas, Austin, and his PhD from the University of Michigan. So what I'd like to do is go ahead and turn it over to George, and feel free to take it away, George. Sure.
And welcome everyone. Saturday morning, and we're going to think about geology. It tells us about our lives. I mean, what aren't we doing? But I hope to make the hour interesting and informative to you. Sandy indicated that I arrived here in the Pleistocene, 1970. This title slide showing wonderful fold structures near Colossal Cave. And for those of you who are not Tucsonans, I'll have a geographical set of slides later on that will acquaint you with the location. But I am reminding myself that when I came here in 1970 for my interview trip, I came here from the University of Michigan. During my PhD program, I wanted to make a good impression, so I went out and I bought a three-piece suit and some wingtips so I could look good in Tucson. And you know, you can imagine what the temperature was like in February as I'm wearing my three-piece wool suit. I was smart enough to suggest that maybe I could stay another day and head to the field. And my predecessor, Evans B. Mayo, said, absolutely. And on a Saturday morning back in 1970 in February, he took me along with his other students out to this location. It's La Sevilla Picnic Ground, where I beheld these amazing fold structures. We call them recumbent, they're lying on their side. And in the background, we see the Rincon Mountains proper, Rincon Peak in the background. My dissertation was all about folding of rocks. And so, you know, I knew that if I were lucky enough to get this job, I would want to return to the site and begin working there. I mean, that's one of the reasons I began working on the Rincon so early. And just to, just to add color to all of this, back in those days, we geologists would just work alone. You'd go out by yourself, no cell phone, no nothing, no field assistant. And it was just tremendous freedom. And so I went out there the first day to anticipate hiking up this hill to look at the folds up close and just simply walk out some of these fold structures. And I came to a lock gate, and it was just not a normal lock gate. There was a huge sign, a bold sign that basically says, no trespassing, beware, trained attack dogs, trained attack dogs. And I ignored that warning. And for the next, I would say, 8 to 10 weeks, I went out there every Tuesday morning and just tiptoed around up on that hill. And then I would tiptoe past the ranch house, hoping that I wouldn't be attacked by trained attack dogs and have my throat munched. And then I got up my nerve to call the rancher. And after a few telephone calls, I persuaded him that my students and I could come out only on Thursdays to basically map these rocks. Thankfully, I think there was some druggy stuff going on back there in those days. And we discovered the first day when we drove back to the ranch house that the trained attack dogs consisted of one basset hound, and that he became the mascot for our first mapping project with Rincons. It took me some years, several, before I trespassed beyond these fold structures into the heart of the Rincons. My first interests were in the folds, in the rocks above the granitic rocks of the Rincons. But I managed to finally bust through, and that was really, really important scientifically. You can see we're flying the flag of Ukraine this morning. We have the luxury this morning and the freedom to be able to spend our time thinking about what happened 25 million years ago. But we know simultaneously what these folks in Ukraine, these brothers and sisters in Ukraine are thinking about right now. I'll be talking about fault damage. Damage is an important word in geology, structural geology, fault damage. The Ukraine is suffering a different kind of damage, to be sure. So we salute them and their heroism, and we pray for them. Okay, let's see if we can advance the slide. That's going to be important. For some reason, it's not advancing. There we go. Those of us who live in Tucson, glance up at the Rincon Mountains periodically, maybe a couple of times during the day. The sunrises are fantastic. We look out there to the east and we see the dome-shaped anatomy of Mica Mountain here on the left. And here's Mica Mountain here on the right. You can see my pointer, I hope. And then this is the outline, the profile of Tanque Verde Ridge near the Loop Drive in Sora National Park. Every now and then somebody makes the mistake of asking me, tell me about the Rincon Mountains, or what are the Rincon Mountains about? That's probably a dangerous thing to do. But what I'd like to start with is basically give a little bit of an elevator speech, a kind of a takeaway regarding what I'd like you to be thinking about and taking away in regard to the Rincon geology. And here it is during daytime. We're looking east. We see Tanque Verde Ridge. I've written all over the mountain, as you can see. I've drawn lines and I have arrows. We're looking at Rincon Peak in the background. If I were to give an elevator speech for the Tucson Mountains, which I talked about last year, it would be in some ways a simple speech. The Tucson Mountains express a 70 million year old volcano that just blew up and tossed ash 100,000 feet in the air. And then later, the volcano was tilted on its side, so that today we can go on the west side of the Tucson Mountains and we can look at the plumbing of the volcanic system because the volcano is tilted on its side. We can see underneath it where the magma shot forward and upward, and we can actually see the landscape on which the volcano was built. That's the importance of the fact that we have the Tucson Mountains geologically sitting on the edge of town. Here, the Rincons, it's a much more difficult story, in part because, in contrast to thinking about volcanoes that we can see in person in Hawaii, or we can look at videos, volcanoes are surface processes. What created the Rincon Mountains took place at tremendous depths. Well, maybe not tremendous, but 8 miles down, 10 miles down, by processes that we're not familiar with typically in our lay life. Plastic deformation, brittle deformation, and so on. So that's the challenge. It's a challenge for Pima County Park and Recreation, Sora National Park, Sonoran Desert Museum, George Davis, attempting to communicate to the public what the Rincons are all about. There's hardly a framework or an anchor that we can grab hold of. But nonetheless, the elevator speech is the following: that the Rincon Mountains and its sibling, the Catalina Mountains, have along their margin a huge fault that is inclined at a low angle, 10 degrees underneath Tucson. If we were to go to the Tanque Verde Mountain today, we could walk this line that I've drawn here, and we could see from place to place the expression of this fault, almost like a parking lot pavement that just dips and inclines underneath us. And we call that the Catalina Fault. And everything that we see in the Rincon Mountains, here's Rincon Peak, here's Tanque Mountain, all the way up to Mica Mountain, all of that rock we can loosely call granite right now has been drawn up from great depth, earthquake by earthquake by earthquake, to the surface of the earth. This rock started its journey, again, 8 miles deep, not probably, west of the Tucson Mountains, maybe over near Avra Valley. And like an escalator, it slowly moved up to become exposed at the surface. Earthquake by earthquake by earthquake. And this took place between, say, 26 million years before present and 18 million years before present. Tucson Mountains, volcanic eruption, 70 million years before present. This is young stuff, 26 to say 18 million years ago. And then if we could go back in time, up here where the sky is, at that level, as this faulting was taking place, there was rock up there that earthquake by earthquake by earthquake moved down and to the southwest. And part of that rock that was up in the air and moved down is the Tucson Mountains, the rock of the Tucson Mountains. So that's the 3D complication that we're going to try to deal with here today. Now, this is a digital elevation model, and I bet you can recognize it. We'll start with Push Ridge. This is the Catalina Mountains right here. I can orient you by just going through and showing you the ranges and some place names. Here's the Tortolita Mountains out here. Here's the Tucson Mountains right here. Look how diminutive they look, so eroded. Here's San Pedro Valley. Here's Push Ridge. There's Mount Lemmon. This is Agua Caliente Park. This is Tanque Ridge, Saguaro National Park, Rincon Mountain District. The Loop Drive is right in here. Mica Mountain, that dome-shaped beauty that we look at each morning. Rincon Peak, the Colossal Cave area. La Sevilla Folds are right up in that little area. You can go to them anytime. Take your picnic lunch and just sit there and look at folds and don't worry about attack dogs. They're not around. And here's Happy Valley. This is the trace of the fault. This is the Catalina Fault. It is unbroken as you follow it from the tip of Push Ridge through the Agua Caliente area and the Reddington Pass area, around the nose of Tanque Ridge, down into the reentrant. Some of you know that X9 Ranch is deep in that recess in Rincon Valley. You come around to Colossal Cave area and Posta Camada, and then you take it toward Benson, where it stops at the southeast corner of the Rincons. Look at that. It stops here at Push Ridge. It stops here right at southeast corner of the Rincons. It stops for a reason. There's a big younger fault that just cuts it off, that defines the steep eastern margin of the Rincons. You can just see it, right? Look at that. And then Saddlebrook, so maybe someone's here from Saddlebrook, on the west side, Oro Valley, all along that western steep edge of the Catalinas, there's a big fault, a young fault, not active. These are not active faults. And that comes along that it cuts off the Catalina Fault there. But it's unusual to have such a long, unbroken fault segment. And that thing, it's hard to visualize, but it's like an inclined plane that's dipping down underneath the University of Arizona, underneath Lowe's, underneath Walmart. It's underneath everything. It's just dipping gently down, 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 going deep into the crust. These are the Galliero Mountains off to the east. Now, I hope you'll love this particular image. Look at this image. This is a 1960s U-2 spy plane photograph of Tucson as it was spread out, not so much, in the 1960s. And it's an oblique aerial photograph that allows us to look not only over to the Galliero Mountains over here, but we're even picking up some of the Penaleño Mountains over here and the Winchesters. But here's the Catalinas. There's Mount Lemmon right up here. There's Push Ridge through here. Here's these big young faults that I talked about, the Pirate. And here's another one over here. It got shifted a little bit. And then here's the Catalina Fault coming through here, as I promised, Push Ridge, through all these gated communities. I live in one, right? The Catalina foothills. I love the Rincons because the access is so clear and clean compared to trying to get at the limited fault exposures in the foothills of the Catalinas, especially given the buildup of homes in there. You just can't get in and map easily. You spend all your time trying to get permissions. And then it comes around through Reddington Pass, Soar National Park, deep into the Rincon, X9 Ranch, and so on. What does Rincon mean? It means inside corner. Inside corner. Look at this inside corner right here in X9 Ranch area. That's the origin of the name of Rincon, like so. Some of you have been around long enough, like me, where back in the early 70s, you'd look up in the air, had that feeling, you had that sneaky suspicion, and there would be a long-winged, silent black plane flying by, one of the U-2 spy planes. I had a friend who worked out there. He told me that they go on these missions, but they're kind of hokey, you know, they fly out to some arbitrary latitude, longitude spot and they take pictures. I said, why don't you take pictures for me for geology field camp? How about some aerial photographs for us? And he says, okay. And I would go out there and carry photographic paper that I would buy myself, strange paper, by the way. And it was like I was in my trench coat as a spy, giving Davis Monson some paper. And then about 2 months later, I get these unbelievable photographs. You could almost read license plates on cars. Well, speaking of photography, I think it's useful to, not useful, but part of the purpose of this talk is hoping to allow you to see the Rincons differently than you have in the past. I want you to be able to almost sense the orientation and the position of the fault, the Catalina Fault, and its influence on topography. And I have Pete Kresan to thank. Some of you out there, I know, maybe a lot of you know Pete Kresan, professional photographer, geologist, colleague, friend. We went out on a shoot about a year ago or so in relationship to a book manuscript that my students and colleagues and I are preparing, and to get some shots that show the Catalina Fault traces. So here we're at the southeast corner of the Rincons. We're almost to Benson, and we're looking west at the east side of the Rincons. Now, look at this. Look at the topography of this part of the Rincons. It looks like a doorstop, doesn't it? It looks like a doorstop. And just above the horizon, I can just guarantee that that's where the Catalina Fault was once located before it became eroded away. And your challenge is to picture up here on top that there is plenty of geology, plenty of rocks that were up here that got moved in this direction and landed somewhere down here, earthquake by earthquake. I can guarantee that if we walk down this declivity, God help us, we come out right here and we could see the Catalina Fault. We know that this trace is on target in position and in orientation. So here's another shot of it. There's the trace of the fault. This zooming is so hard. I have no idea whether you're picking up on what I'm saying. I can't see faces, but let's just hope. And then way off in the distance is a place called Charlie's Cliff. It's another area that we work on. That way off in the distance, and there's Charlie's Cliff in another Pete Kresan pano. These panos are unreal, as you'll soon see. So now we're looking at a panoramic looking west, and here's Mica Mountain, our dome-shaped mountain. Doesn't look quite as dome-shaped from this angle. And then way over here, I mean, here's Look at, there's Mica Mountain off in the distance. That tells you how much line length Pete Kresan has captured in this panoramic image. And then we have Charlie's Cliff. It just almost hurts your head to think about climbing up here. And maybe you can already imagine that this little line right here, this little line of mine, it makes me want to sing. Look at that. Look at that. Here it is closer up. That's the Catalina Fault right here. When I say low dipping, low inclination, gently dipping, that's what I'm talking about. Some of you carry in your mind the San Andreas Fault, perhaps, vertical, horizontal shifts going on. No, we're talking about a very gently dipping fault. And let's think way back. You saw some recumbent fold structures right in the beginning. The limestones are sitting above the fault. And here we have limestones sitting above the fault. There's the fault trace. Here's the fault trace. We go back and forth. It doesn't take much imagination to say something's happening right along here. This is the dividing line between the granites of the mountain and the stuff that I've been saying is way up in the sky. You have to imagine it came down. Well, we don't have to imagine it here. We see it. It's glued on to this area. And these are big outcrops of limestone. Look at the limestone. Look at this photography of Pete Kresan. These giant telephoto lenses that he has and his skill in shooting and lightrooming the results, photoshopping the results. And these are limestone beds. They've never been heated up. They've been always up near the top of the cross. They've been on a little fault journey. They've been broken up. They've never been metamorphosed. They've never seen 8 miles down. These rocks down below, they came up from 8 miles down. These are strange bedfellows to be in contact with one another. Challenging geology. There's more. Let's go around Charlie's Cliff. Let's go back to the Colossal Cave area. Now we're looking east, and here's Rincon Peak. And here are limestones near the Attack Dog location. And look at this little cliff exposure right in here. That's where the fault is. That's where it is. Just a little snippet of it. There's a close-up view, and it indicates, first of all, this is a fault. Look how it looks like a straight line. In 3D, it's a plane. You know, it's a perfect plane at this scale. Although the U2 image that I showed you indicates that it's a curved plane. It has lots of corrugations in it as well. So see this? Here we go. There's the fault. Here are the limestones. The fault is right on the other side of these limestones. We can't see it from this location. Knowing how difficult this is to visualize, I think it's helpful to take a look at a geological cross-section, simple one, that shows the Catalina Fault as it goes down deep into the earth. The panoramic photographs that Pete took were of the relationships way up here. This is the Santa Catalina Mountains, but it's a cross-section that applies to the Rincons. This is a section that was put together by John Spencer, who just retired recently from the Arizona Geological Survey. It's a beautiful cross-section. Number one, here's our fault in the black line. Number two, look at how domed the fault is. You see, John has shown it above the ground surface right here. This would be equivalent of the Mica Mountain doming that we see. And then it just heads down at a low angle, gets a little bit steeper. You see that? The arrows indicate the relative motion. I'm saying time and again, the rock that we see on Mica Mountain and Tanque Verde Ridge was drawn up like this arrow to the surface. And all of this stuff that's in the Tucson Mountains, tilted, started out way up here and moved down in this direction. John's cross section shows one more thing that isn't noticeable right away. But look at this. The fault is coming down through here and it seems to stop at 10 kilometers depth. But look at this. The zone keeps going. A big theme that we're going to enter here quickly is that when you get down to this kind of depth, the rocks are so hot that when faulting takes place, it's just not a little brittle break that slides, but rather the rock behaves like plastic, like taffy. And what you have toward the surface as a plane becomes a mile thick zone or more that's made up of sheared plastic rock. And we'll see that up close and personal. Don't let this scare you right away. Keep the faith. This is a cartoon that I drew to try to help visualize things. And we're going to start down here at D, at the bottom. Mica Mountain, I keep coming back to this dome shape right here. See the dome shape? This is the position in this cartoon of the Rincons and Mica Mountain. And look at this little triangle right here. That symbolizes the Tucson Mountain volcano that's slightly tilted. So U of A is right in here. Tucson Basin is right in here. Mica Mountain, the Galliero Mountains way over here. What is this deal here that is red? Well, that deal is my simulation that helps us understand where these rocks on Mica Mountain were before the Catalina Fault moved them. So if we go back to 26 million years ago, these rocks down here were just innocently doing whatever rocks do at 8 miles down. They're west of the Tucson Mountains. They're deep, maybe not this deep, but they're deep. And then you start the escalator. Boom, boom, boom. And this is just a little patch that we're following, that all of this stuff is moving up. And it works its way up. This is 30 million years before present. This is 25 million years before present. This is 22 million years before present. It's getting close to the surface. And by the time we get to today, those rocks that were down deep are exposed at the surface. So we're seeing in these rocks on the surface things we've never seen before. You know, those of us who are non-geologists, we go to a national park like Grand Canyon and we see the stack of Grand Canyon rocks, and somebody says that was a sand dune. We say, oh yeah, I know what that is. Or that was a shallow sea. Look at the fossils. We say, I know what that was. But here, I might say, hey, look at this. Here's some cataclysite. Here's some pseudotachyllite. Here's some ultramilonite. These are bizarre words, you know, for bizarre rocks that we've never really thought about. We've got better things to do as a society, but there they are. Now, I keep talking about what's coming up, but there's also rock up here. Look at this little brown rock right through here at the top surface 30 million years ago. Look at this, it gets snapped by faulting and it gets moved down to here and it gets moved down to here and it gets moved down. All of this rock is moving down and eventually it finds itself sitting on rocks that were much deeper at one time. That's the pitch. Here's a 3D diagram that shows the same kind of thing. The doming of the Rincon Mountains, the Catalina Fault going down deep, the ridges and corrugations on the fault. And finally, I'm delivering the goods and saying, what's unique about the Rincon Mountains and mountains like it is that they weren't formed in compression and shortening like most mountains of the world. They were formed by stretching and pulling apart. These are mountains that became domed up in a stretching process. Here's the relationship between this funky diagram and the Rincon Mountains. I've twisted the Rincons a little bit. You see Tanqueverde Ridge? That's one of these corrugations on a big fault that's regional, like right through here. And the movement was off to the southwest. The setup for the next slide is these strange terms, cataclysite, myelinite. These are rocks that were fashioned out of granite during the transport up to the surface. And they're terrible words: pseudotachelite, myelinite, cataclysite. We call these are terms for fault rocks. We have igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary rocks. There's a fourth category that hardly anybody speaks about or acknowledges, but we can't do without them. Fault rocks, rocks that were ground up or plastically deformed during faulting. And in this diagram, this shows a big fault zone that goes from the surface down to deep depths. And down here at deep depths, the rock flows plastically. Up here, it breaks brittly and is ground to clay. And in the middle, you get a kind of a mix, really crushed up rocks. And the way it works, let me go back here. The way it works is when this rock comes up from great depth, these plastic rocks, the myelinites, the broken rocks, the cataclysites, get laid out in a kind of a stratigraphy that tells us about that journey. What does a myelinite look like? It doesn't look like a normal granite that's on in your kitchen forming a table. Yes, we can recognize there are feldspars and there's quartz, but we look microscopically at it and we can see that it's flowed like taffy because it was faulted in an environment where quartz, or as my professor of mineralogy used to say it, quartz, he was from Boston, quartz it flows like taffy. But the feldspars at that temperature break up like cashews. So you get a mix of plastic and broken material. And up at the surface, you can't form plastic materials because it's too cold and brittle. But you just pulverize things into clay gouge, or you break it up into fragments like this. This is the same rock that existed at depth, but it broke as opposed to flowed. And then in between, you get this rock I used to call junk rock. I didn't even know what it was. I called it junk rock. It looks firebombed. It's just this horrifically altered, broken material. It's all through Sora National Park. It just makes you terrified. And in that rock, there are these funny things from place to place. These are called fossil earthquakes. This is frictional melt, where at great depth, when there was a big earthquake, the earthquake, due to fault slip, heated up the rocks even more than they were. And so some of the rock melted. And the melted material entered cracks and cooled quickly to form glass, black glass. I love the name fossil earthquakes. You don't see those every day, but you see them in the Rincons. And that tells you we're not dealing with sand dunes blowing across the surface of the earth. We're talking about deep processes. So these rocks are laid out. I won't go through these gory details, but you have the fault, and then beneath it, you have these fault rocks, including the plastically deforming rocks, a mile of them, plus these horrific broken rocks as well. And we've mapped them in detail in places like Saguaro National Park and other areas all around the Rincons. So when you go to Saguaro National Park and you drive the loop road, you're basically driving along the Catalina Fault. You're driving along the rocks that were pulverized. You're driving next to and along the rocks that are mylonites, taffy-like. That is a accessible national park exposure of some very unusual features. This map of the Rincons shows the places where we mapped the details. But I think what you might be interested in is what the Rincons look like in a multispectral view. That is, you look at the mountain and you can make out, we've just drawn an easy line that's parallel to a very clear aerial remote sensing manifestation of it. That's the Catalina Fault. All this turquoise stuff is the mylonite, and all this mustard color stuff in here is the broken rock. So that helps us immensely in mapping out these distributions. Did I tell you? I know I didn't. When I came here in 1970 in my three-piece suit, I figured, oh, I hope I get this job. But one disappointment when I get the job, if I do get it, is that the Catalinas and the Rincons will have already been mapped in detail, because there's a USGS office there, US Geological Survey. The university's been there for 100 years. Guess what? They weren't mapped or studied in any detail because they don't have ore deposits. There was no gold, silver, copper. And so these mountains weren't particularly interesting. Plus, they had funky rocks. Who wants to work on some of these things? Yes, that was an aside. Okay, I want to show you some, get away from the most of the abstract and get into what these things look like and have a little bit of fun. Some of you have been to Agua Caliente Spring, Agua Caliente Park near Redington Pass. You won't be surprised to learn at this point that there must be some relationship between the spring and the Catalina Fault. Can we say bullseye? Look at that, right on the fault. Right on the fault. And if we draw a cross section, there's the fault. There's the spring. I mean, right on the fault. So snow melt and rain hit Mica Mountain. The water goes through the cracks of the rocks. It moves down under influence of gravity. It comes out on the underside of the fault, can't get to the surface. It works its way up the fault and comes out, daylights at Agua Caliente Park. You just know how that's influenced history. Hohokam, cowboys, ranchers, tourists, entrepreneurial enterprise. The rock that's been brittly deformed is just crazy strange. It's like black obsidian. And speaking of the Hohokam, the desert varnish on the black rock had lended itself to petroglyphs. This is ground up rock right beneath the Catalina Fault. Other ground up rock is just loaded with these funny cracks like this and this. They're everywhere. Old faults, old damage. These cracks are habitats for rattlesnakes, pack rats, desert tortoises. Don Swan, biologist at Saguaro Park, showed me a photograph. Hibernation time in one of these cracks. Pack rat using a rattlesnake as a pillow with a desert tortoise in the background. The pack rat community understood that these rattlesnakes didn't want to have a undigested pack rat in their belly during the course of hibernation. Javelina rocks, look at this. Can we now see the influence of the Catalina Fault in the topography Can we not see the lines of shear in Javelina rocks? Can we not see the ledgy nature of the mylonites, the deep rocks that made it to the surface? Everything is imprinted by the shearing that brought things up to the surface. You want to see some rocks and structures, go to Lower Tanque Verde Falls and Reddington Pass. Here's a small fault. This isn't the Catalina Fault. This is just a little fault, but look how beautiful it is. And look at these smaller faults that kind of tuck into it. And yes, this is where we see fossil earthquakes. You know, see all this black material through here? Right underneath the underside, there was crushing and some formation of glass. And then in thin section, microscopically, we see these crazy textures, including how the glass is flowed. You know, the melted material flowed into some of the cracks. You know, when this picture was taken, it was last summer with all the rains. Javelina Picnic Ground in Sora National Park. And we're seeing the ledgy topography of the mylonites. Usually the ledges are beautiful dry waterfalls, not last spring, not last summer. How do we know which way the fault moved material? Everywhere we look down at the rocks, we see these lines. That is, Mother Nature just left the tracks of the direction. And the direction is always 240 degrees, southwest, always. Everything moved in the same direction. Some material is just extraordinarily sheared. These are microscopic views of the spiraling of minerals and the lining up of micas like they're fish in the stream, everything in motion. Here are my boys. This is back in 1978. Look at this. This is Drew, lawyer in San Francisco. He doesn't look like a lawyer right now. This is Matt, Presbyterian minister in Northern California, Mendocino. And this is Mike, head of school, Colorado Academy. They just always insisted that I take them out to look at ultramyelonite, pseudotacholite, ultracataclysite, and mylonites. They just couldn't get enough. And they really like this one right here. Look at this folding and flowing of the rocks. We decided to have a reunion at this location. Look at this one right here. We had a ultramyelonite reunion. And you can see how son Matt dressed up for it. He knew that he had worn a tank top in the early shot. So he gets his tank top going on. And Mike remembered how he was holding his hands. And look at Drew, you know, he's trying to simulate the old days. What I love about this shot, besides my boys, is the fact that this saguaro cactus didn't exist at this site back in 1977. Speaking of the old days, this is George Davis with hair. This is Peter Coney, my close friend and colleague. The two of us got together. I pulled out this morning a letter. Do you remember what a letter is? A real letter? Look at this. It's dated February 6, 1974. Dear George, this is from Peter, Middlebury College. I'm sure you have no idea who I am, but I was much interested in your abstract in the Geological Society of America Dallas meetings. The reason is that it appears we have both pulled the same stunt on the same problem and in conflict with the same earlier worker. I enclose a preprint of a manuscript that's in press. If you have anything ready of your own work, I would be most interested in seeing it. He was working in the Snake Range of Utah, me and the Rincons, and our mountains and structures were identical. And the upshot was that by 1976, in 1975, we recruited Pete to the University of Arizona. But by 1976, we had identified 25 Rincon mountain-like structures from Hermosillo to Alaska. These are just some of them. Here's the Rincon Catalinas, and they're all lookalikes. Picacho Mountain, South Mountain, White Tank, Harquavala, Buckskin, Whipples, Chimawavy, Sacramento. They're all in a line and they're all getting stretched out. And Peter in 1973 referred to these generally as core complexes, metamorphic core complexes. In 1977, we held a conference, 72 people came right on Tanque Verde Guest Ranch on the fault, and we compared notes on the facts about all these mountains, and as a result of that, identified a whole new mountain system formed by extension in the Western Cordillera. People would ask Peter and I, well, if you're so smart, where are others in the world? We had no answer. Now we know they're all over the place, including the Aegean Sea. So that's the story, part of it anyway. I'm thanking people here, including Sandy. Access is so critical. Being able to collect samples is so critical. And I'm thanking donors who responded to our crowdfunding to help us support a research project we started 2 years ago, 18 of us, 19 of us. And I'm pleased to say that the book manuscript has been reviewed. We survived. We're improving it. On April Fool's Day, the revision will be into the Geological Society. And now I'm hoping that the Rincons never quite look the same to you again. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, George. That was fantastic. And I know I'm going to have to look at this one again. So much good information. And I get a little distracted sometimes looking at the chat box, so I miss a few things. But we'll give it a few minutes here and see if we got any questions. Now, I think this is one that you already covered, but since there aren't any other questions in the chat box right now, I'll see if you want to expand on this question. Someone asked, did the volcanic activity in the Tucson Mountains occur before or after their separation from the Santa Catalina Range, which I know you've discussed some of that.
Yeah, the Tucson Mountain caldera, volcanic caldera, formed 70 million years ago. And the faulting that we've talked about today initiated 26 million years ago. So that volcano was quite cool by that time. Sandy, do we want to keep the PowerPoint up, screen sharing? Or is that okay? Or
you know, we can go ahead if you would like to stop the sharing, and then, you know, it's such a beautiful photo. You can leave it, you leave that beautiful photo you took up if you like, but we'll go ahead and yeah, take it down. Let's see, we've got some more questions here. Someone mentioned they were at Agua Caliente Park this morning, so they say they can appreciate that even more after your interesting talk of that. And someone asked about the limestone of Colossal Cave. How does the limestone of Colossal Cave fit in as far as time and, you know, in time and space?
Yeah, the limestone around Colossal Cave is Paleozoic in age. So it's really older than the Tucson Mountain caldera, for example, and deposited at the surface of the earth as limestones are. And I'm hesitating because all of those folds that we see that I mapped initially probably did not form when the faulting took place. It may be that both the limestones formed and then they were folded even before the final faulting took place. And so that's another complicated part of the story. If I were in a room right now with all of you, the one thing that I would do that I haven't been able to do is to just put my hands like this, and with this hand, just reach down 8 miles. And with this hand, pretending that here are the limestones way up here near the surface of the earth. And then I'm just going to bring these things down like this and rotate. And so the limestones up high and the mylonites down deep end up in Colossal Cave in contact with one another. There's no right for them to be in contact with one another. Something big had to happen. How far did these limestones travel? Buckle your seatbelt. that came from the area of Benson, 35 kilometers away. It's tremendous movement. This is what I call a crust-busting fault.
All right, great demo there. I like that. That really brings a good visual to mind. I appreciate that. Someone did ask for how you would define fault.
A fault. Let's enter into it step by step. There's a fracture that can open that we would call a fissure. We would worry about falling into one. They form maybe during some earthquakes. There are cracks in the rock we call joints. They abound in Texas Canyon. Just a little, I'm going to exaggerate, just a little tiny bit of movement this way. Faults are cracks that are marked by sliding. And in our case, like here, sliding like so. And it's not a wee, let's slide. It is stress that builds up, and the rocks are like a spring. And the spring gets tighter and tighter, and then the elastic strength of the rock is overcome, and there's an earthquake. And then there's a pause. Maybe that earthquake creates 4 feet of slip, or 8 feet of slip, or 3 inches of slip. And then the elastic strain builds up and up and up and up and up. And then the friction is overcome and it goes again. And over 8 million years, you're going to get a lot of movement. And you get a lot of scratches on that fault plane to tell you what the direction of motion was.
All right, thanks, George. Someone asked about how Rincons are related to the Santa Ritas.
Well, the Santa Ritas are a completely different mountain. They're both sky islands. I was tempted in my abstract for this talk. I did talk about sky islands. So they have in common the fact that they're very, very tall, 10,000 feet versus 9,000 feet. But their geology is completely different. When you work in the geology of the Santa Ritas, you're picking up a different window of history of Southern Arizona from the window of history we pick up in the Catalinas and Rincons, which is different than the history we pick up in the Tucson Mountains. We're in the basin and range, and things pop up or go down like keyboards. Imagine a piano keyboard. And then if we can just press down the keys and make them stick, but maybe they're kind of random. Half of them go down, half of them go up, but they're random. And let's make the keyboard a whole circular table of keyboard keys. So here we are as geologists dealing with what has popped up. And we look at it and we look at that key and figure out what's there. But we wish it all had popped up in ways that we could see it. I mean, eventually we put it together, try to put it together.
All right, thanks, George. Someone commented that this was outstanding presentation and asked, where were you when they took geology in college?
Where was I when I took
geology? They wish that you had taught them, I believe is their comment, yes.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that comment a lot.
I could say the same thing, I think. I remember taking some geology, but...
So can I tell a geology joke just that goes along with this?
As long as it's a good, clean one, sure.
It's a good, clean one. There was one of my PhD students loved this ad on TV about 12 years ago, and it showed this professor, geology professor, looking pretty dorky. And the students were all slobbering and sleeping, their heads are down. And the geology professor in this ad takes about 15 seconds to say, erosion is a very slow process. It's just a great ad. Erosion is. Oh man, I look at that and I just die.
That's good. Now, someone asked if you recommend any books that would be, kind of more basic reader level, not maybe necessarily college level, about the geology.
Yeah, that's really tricky. I think I would recommend Roadside Geology, and Steve Reynolds, who is an ASU distinguished professor and who worked on these metamorphic core complexes when he was a PhD student here. In fact, more than worked on them, he's a major player. He's now the author of Roadside Geology in Arizona. He's a fabulous teacher, and the illustrations are phenomenal. I think he has one edition out of it, and I know he's working on another edition right now. So I would go to that. It's bite-sized in the sense that you can plan a trip to a given location, and there will be something that Steve has to say. I think it's good to just incrementally bite-size, pick up on geological factoids and concepts through going and seeing and having a book like Roadside Geology along with you.
All right, I'm looking for some more questions here. Someone mentioned that they felt an earthquake, they thought, near Colossal Cave a few years ago, and wondering which fault was associated with that.
Well, when people ask we geologists at the U of A whether people should worry about earthquakes, on the one hand, we say, nah, because we only see maybe one fault scarp. It's in the Santa Rita mountain area, a little fault scarp there. And things look pretty dead. And we see balanced rocks around, and we think, well, if there's a big earthquake, those rocks would have fallen. They no longer would be balanced. But we're reminded that in the late 1800s, right across the border from Douglas, there was a huge earthquake, one of the biggest earthquakes in North America. Whatever fault produced the ground shaking felt at Colossal Cave would not have been the Catalina Fault. It would have been some other fault, and I know of no active fault around there, so I don't know what it would have been.
Okay. All right, let's see. We did have someone who says their son was one of your students at the Geology Lab Tech at Pasadena City College, and I'll pass on some of that information. It's more of a lengthy message, and I'll pass that on to you so you can see. And they say he was mapping Polita folds as an 11-year-old. So it sounds like he really, he got him started. Yeah, very good. Let's see if we got any more questions. I don't see any more questions right at this time, but if George is okay, we'll stick around for another minute or two and see if anybody has any more questions. And some of you asked about if you'll have access to the recording of this presentation. And yes, we have recorded this, and we'll send a link most likely later today, but it could be if they're kind of backed up with Zoom, it might be a day or two, but you will if you signed up for this, you'll receive a link to the recording. And I know I'm going to watch it again because there's so much good information here. Just a lot of good comments, George. Everybody really appreciated. But if you're okay with hanging out for another minute, see if we got any more questions.
I am. As you might suspect, I worked hard to try to make this understandable. Presented it in a way that I've never presented it before. And I don't need feedback right now, but if any of you would provide feedback as to whether I was successful in communicating the main concept of the faulting, that would be useful to me from the standpoint of teaching and pedagogy. And I mean, part of our goal is to think of it, Sonora National Park, Pima County Park and Recreation, Sonoran Desert Museum. Part of the goal is to try to be effective in explaining and helping to interpret natural history in a community, Tucson, that is full of people interested in natural history. And so eventually we'd like to have in these various sites interpretation information that is really going to be useful to people. We started that at Soar National Park. And along the way, there's things that are so important for me to learn that comes in this mutual communication. Here's the best example I can think of. I mentioned Don Swan, the geologist and hydrologist at Soar National Park. And he hides his geological background, but not successfully. He's a Brown University graduate, and he knows geology. But he's trying to get this core complex detachment fault stuff in his head. And one day he says, tell me again the names of these mountains like the Rincons in southern Arizona. And so I go through the rosary, Tortolitas, Suizo Hills, Picachos, White Tank, South Mountain, Harquahala, Harquavar, Rawhide, Buckskin, Whipple. And he says to me, most of those are desert tortoise habitats. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness. Just like Soar National Park East, a desert tortoise habitat. And you may remember that I said there's a certain rock unit in there that's full of these cracks and fissures. And that's where the critters hang out. And Dawn and I want to make some trips to determine whether the tortoises and the Harquahalas and the buckskins are in that same rock unit. That would be pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And then we'd write a paper on the tectonic habitats of desert tortoises, connecting pieces that normally we would never imagine would connect.
Excellent. So we do have a question from one of our volunteers who's been leading some geology walks, and she asks if was a silicified quartz site at Colossal Cave Mountain Park formed at the same time as the metamorphic core complex?
The answer is yes. The Catalina Fault is a really deep fault that goes way down, and it became an important part of the plumbing system as hot water solutions. Geologists don't call them that. They call them hydrothermal fluids. Hydrothermal fluids, hot fluids, migrated up along the fault at the time that the fault was active. And the hot fluids encountered those limestones, and they had a party. There was a chemical reaction there in which the silica quartz, the silica dissolved in the hydrothermal fluids, reacted with the carbonates of the limestone, and the carbonates were in part replaced by the silica. So you're walking around the Colossal Cave area. On one hand, you see gray limestones the way they should be, and then you get this black, brown, red-brown stuff that's really hard, made of quartz. That's the silica breccia. That's fragmental.
All right. I think there was one more question. I'm trying to get back here. Somebody asked if maybe you want to give a little more information about your current project that you did mention that you're working on, the crowdfunding Source One.
Sure. In January of 2020, in fact, before that, I started trying to recruit PhD students who were already here at U of A, and postdocs and colleagues and adjunct professors and visiting scientists to take on a new research project in the Rincons. And thankfully, I don't know how it all worked so successfully. My screen is behaving badly. Can you hear me, everybody?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, can hear you and see you.
Okay, you can see me. Okay. So what was my motivation? In part, this is sort of nitty gritty. A strong department like U of A has postdoctoral students who come in, maybe there'll be 10 a year. And these postdoctoral students typically are working intensively on a project they had in mind when they came here, and they're working with one colleague or two colleagues. And I just felt that, what if I can recruit some of these amazing postdocs, recruit them and have them work on a project close to home as just a part of what they do? Thinking, how sad would it be if you'd spend 3 years as a postdoc here and never see the Rincons, so the core complex. And it all worked. And so this group of 19 of us thankfully started doing our field work in January of 2020. We went out for about 2 weeks and we got a head start on it, not realizing the pandemic would hit in March. But we kept on that whole period of time. And the result is a book manuscript that we're just working like dogs on, that is not just about the structure, but it's about the timing of when things happen with extremely sophisticated geochronology and thermochronology data, microscopic fabric data, three-dimensional modeling, remote sensing. It represents to me, and I think to those of us who are working together on this, the way life should be. Not George Davis sneaking onto a property worried about trained attack dogs. That is, what I'm saying is working alone on structures, but rather in this day and age with a scientific problem so complex, pulling together a team that includes a lot of specialists in different areas and communicating hard and trying to expand the impact and the knowledge of what comes out of it. And it's been quite a ride. And we never thought we would end up with a book, but it grew and grew. And now we have something that we think will be not only a state-of-the-art description of the tectonic history of the Rincons, but it will be an open invitation for other scientists and students to come here and pick up the ball, doing some sophisticated things that we can't even think about now in the future. And frankly, in the manuscript itself, you have some latitude in the book manuscript, I basically say that's part of the purpose of this. And access is exceptionally good, not only because there's a wilderness area and there's a national park and there's state Arizona trust land and this and that, but the leadership of these various organizations and entities have been open to discovery and learning, allowing us to get on the properties and collect rocks and do the following. So this book project is a combination of hardcore research, but there's pedagogical value. There's, I hope, an emphasis that we're not fully utilizing all the talent that exists in any given department at one time, and we can do a better job of doing that, and that there's a translational societal impact to the knowledge gained if we can learn how to communicate effectively in ways that the lay people who are interested can understand.